A man in the European 16th century was not born simply in the valley of the Thames or the Seine, but in a certain social class, and the environment of that class made and limited his world. He was then, consciously or not fully a man. He was an artisan, and until he complied with the limitations of that class, he was continually knocking his hands, head, and heart against an environment composed of other classes, which limited what he could and could not do, and what he must do. And this greater group environment was not a matter of mere ideas and thought. It was embodied in muscles and armed men, in scowling faces, in the majesty of judge and police and human law, which became divine. A pair of gaming YouTubers I watch both turned me onto the Spiders Games video games a while back, and since the first time I beat Greedfall, I've been meditating on when and how to share this game with you all. A lot has happened since I first played it, including the release of Greedfall 2 in early access last year. As I understand it, that prequel is set to come out this year, so I've been taking this time to think about the relationship I have to this game, and what it philosophically inspires in me. I've sat on this one for some time with the intention of developing a perspective on this game that I haven't seen before. The game opens on a scene of the player character, clearly a member of the nobility, posing for their portrait. The player is immediately offered a number of customization options, venturing from basic alternative appearances to starting skill trees to placing single points in favored attributes and talents. The attribute systems will govern chiefly the quality of equipment of a certain kind the player will use, as well as modify certain base stats. Talents also modify these stats but offer bonuses in different situations. The player is asked from the first screen whether they would prefer to be more persuasive in dialogue, be able to craft potions, be able to traverse difficult terrain, and several other possibilities. These modifications on the player character's build have the potential to open up alternative methods of, for example, resolving a quest or obtaining new items. As we conclude our character creation, the painter is interrupted by one Sir du Cosilion, our character's mentor, who notifies us of a few facts. First, we are set to depart on a ship soon. Second, we need to prepare to say our goodbyes. Third, our cousin is missing. The player character, heir of the Desarde family, flees the painter and leaves the building through the courtyard, where they are greeted by another character, their bodyguard Kurt. This is the game's brief combat tutorial and also its introduction of its party mechanic. At any time, Desarde can have up to 2 companions in their party, and Kurt is one of these. He's a big bruiser with armor and a giant sword, made for carrying the player through the earliest combat encounters. Combined with the combat, the party and flow of the game convey a general sense of a kind of Mass Effect-style Souls-like, if a bit unpolished around the edges. The pacing of the combat and some of the hit detection and dodge timing can feel a little awkward, but for this studio this game appears to be a massive leap in a positive direction, so it's hard to argue with results. Desarde must also say goodbye to their mother. Aging, ailing, and blind, she sits alone in her room and waits to die. This is the introduction of the disease called the Malachor into the game narrative, a plague afflicting the mainland of the world of Greedfall. The ultimate objective of finding a cure for the Malachor is presented to the player, despite their inability to save their mother, who imparts as a final gift a token to Desarde, something to do with their past that has yet to be revealed. After this final farewell, the player enters the lower areas of the city of Serene, leading to the docks. Desarde must find their cousin Constantin d'Orsay, the crown prince of the merchant congregation to whom Desarde is to serve as legate. They can meet and speak with Captain Vasco, who is preparing to take them to the island of Tir-Fredi, the new world in whose merchant congregation colony Constantin is to serve as governor. There's a decidedly French air to the merchant congregation and their cultural affect, despite the history of large family-controlled mercantile imperial ventures also evoking Dutch and Italian parallels. And this kind of general colonial aesthetic is maintained in their allies, who are fourfold and each of whom have a single quest Desarde can fulfill while in Serene. The Nauts, represented in the main cast by Vasco, are a seafaring people of no one distinct race or nation, but who rather operate out of all ports of all nations aboard their vessels. While they appear to draw largely from Portuguese culture, one can note their distinctive Maori-inspired facial tattoos. The chief quest for the Nauts sets the tone for their relations to the mainlanders. A cabin boy is missing from Vasco's ship. Investigating his relations and whereabouts yields a trail that allows Desarde to find that his mother and father gave him for a ransom to the Nauts as a small child, and now regret their decision. The boy, for his part, appears to consider the Nauts his true family, and so the player must decide who is in the right and who is in the wrong. The Coin Guard, represented in the main cast by Kurt, are similarly motivated mercenaries, based instead on German historical mercenary armies. Like the Nauts, they have a presence in all three major nations and their colonies, and are mainly invested in protecting their rulers and enforcing the rule of law. Their introductory quest is about some kind of suspicious purchase they've made being held up by a greedy merchant and his faceless master. There's a lot of cloak and dagger in this quest, which in hindsight seems appropriate for this faction generally. This is also a great introduction to the reputation system. The player has an established reputation with every faction, and this can increase or decrease based on how they resolve different quests. The merchandise needs to be removed from a Naut warehouse, so if the player has the science talent, drugging the guards is an option. Killing them would risk damaging the player's reputation with the Nauts. Impersonating a Naut using a Naut uniform found elsewhere on the map, however, can allow the player to trick the guards into abandoning their post so the merchandise can be smuggled aboard the ship. Helping the cabin boy in the previous quest also aids in getting Vasco to cooperate. The Bridge Alliance are one of the two major nations who have active embassies in the merchant congregation settlements. They have a strong Ottoman influence and stand out from the other factions in the degree to which they are thematically written around ideals of the pursuit of knowledge and the practice of the sciences. The ambassador from the Bridge Alliance tips Desarde off about an alchemist peddling snake oil remedies to the people of Serene. Cornering the potion charlatan has him revealing to Desarde that while his potion may be unethical in that it does not have the effects he purports it to have, he originally was ousted as an alchemist of the Bridge Alliance because he took issue with unethical experiments being performed on civilians in an effort to find a cure to the Malachor. The player has a number of options, from turning in the charlatan to the Bridge Alliance to confronting the ambassador on the unethical experiments. The subtlest choice may be to appease the angry mob, allow the charlatan to escape, and play it off as a close miss for the eyes and ears of the Bridge Alliance in Serene. The penultimate faction is a theocratic nation called Teleme. Their aesthetics have clear Spanish influences, although a number of their linguistic influences appear to be Dutch. In either case, they have a profoundly Catholic and Christian quality. The cardinal presiding over the Teleme embassy can be consulted on Desarde's departure to trigger the faction's introductory quest. Teleme is seeking to arrest two heretics. In reality, the two scholars are academics with an alternative theory about the founding myth of the Telemite religion. It turns out that Tir Freddy is the Eden of their faith, but their religion's key figure, Matthias, was apparently inspired not by a holy light, but some voice from beneath the island which persuaded him. Given that the Bridge Alliance and Teleme have a negative relationship, if Desarde has aided the Bridge Alliance in dealing with the charlatan, the ambassador of the Bridge Alliance will agree to help the historians. This will, of course, like with aiding the alchemist, only grant partial approval with Teleme, but any progress in that direction at this stage without loss of reputation is a gain. These quests establish a few key themes for the game. First and most obviously are themes of class struggle and decay, both civilizational and bodily. There is also the obvious narrative tension between the scientific zealots of the Bridge Alliance and the religious zealots of Teleme. But the beginning of the game rounds out by introducing another major theme in the form of its first boss fight. A monstrous-looking creature emerges, looking almost made of wood and vine, but distinctly alive and almost intelligent. The Nauts appear to have recovered it from the island. Its moveset and attacks are somewhat repetitive, but once Desarde makes short work of the creature, its status as an alien being and mystery of nature is left for the future, and the crew boards their vessel and sets sail. Upon flashing forward to the approach of the island, we finally see our title screen, Greedfall. Upon making landfall, Constantine is served a mysterious drink by a group of doctors, ostensibly to quell his non-evident seasickness, and the group are greeted by Lady Lorraine of Morange. Vasco, meanwhile, appears to have been ousted from his duties as a captain by his admiral. The player can bring him into the party and roam freely about the settlement of New Serene, until they encounter Ciora, daughter of a leader of an indigenous tribe, as well as to the other settlements to pick up the companions, Afra of the Bridge Alliance and Petrus of Ptolemy. The player will, as they navigate their various questlines and explore the areas of the island, be required to balance faction disposition in the interest of recruiting different factions to the final mission a la Mass Effect 3. A number of Spider Studios games are clearly BioWare inspired, which of course means they appeal to people like me, and not unlike a few BioWare games, once Greedfall's final fight and cutscene ends, the game is over. There's no post-game content, only Desarde, their relationships, and their choices on their adventure for the player to be content with. For these reasons and more, I think a story-centric critique of the game with a focus on the game's writing is most warranted, and that's exactly what we're here for. So much fear and paranoia has been spread in response to discourses about colonialism and imperialism with the aim of silencing moral and intellectual opposition to those forces, that it is easy to see why many people avoid the topic entirely. It's easy to mishandle a sensitive topic. Moreover, a culture where it is safer to scold the demonstrating protesters, conscientious objectors, and activist refuseniks of the world than it is to exercise one's voice likewise against those levels of international power and control tends to produce a culture of silence as a facade over the economics of violence. So we come to know that silence in the fear of speaking poorly is often preferable to silence that aids and abets power. I don't think discussing how we encounter these ideas is meaningless, even in the sense of the arts. Rather, I think it makes the way with which we engage with artistic meaning accountable to the reality of our world and its situations of injustice. There are two core parallels I would like to invoke in the pursuit of discussing the themes of Greedfall, with special attention paid to the colonial and imperial context of its narrative. With this in mind, I decided to pull from Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, with the aim of developing my own understanding of cultural criticism of imperialist ideals as portrayed in the arts. Said is useful in this, but also in other regards, as he tends to tie his understanding of culture within the empire to the relationship empire develops with its own culture, the way culture reinforces imperialist sensibilities, and also expresses anxieties from within that perspective. My takeaway from reading Said over the past couple years and taking my time to try to understand his perspective — this video was originally conceived like the upcoming Borderlands series retrospective at around the time I was working on the Wolfenstein reboot retrospective, meaning I've been working on both on and off for about a year and a half by the time this video will actually be live — is that, in the end, imperialism and colonialism construct a two-way relationship. Said defines the terms like this. As I shall be using the term, imperialism means the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant territory. Colonialism, which is almost always a consequence of imperialism, is the implanting of settlements on distant territory. As Michael Doyle puts it, empire is a relationship, formal or informal, in which one state controls the effective political sovereignty of another political society. It can be achieved by force, by political collaboration, by economic, social, or cultural dependence. Imperialism is simply the process or policy of establishing or maintaining an empire. In our time, direct colonialism has largely ended. Imperialism, as we shall see, lingers where it has always been, in a kind of general cultural sphere, as well as in specific political, ideological, economic, and social practices. Neither imperialism nor colonialism is a simple act of accumulation and acquisition. Both are supported, and perhaps even impelled, by impressive ideological formations that include notions that certain territories and people require and beseech domination, as well as forms of knowledge affiliated with domination. The vocabulary of classic 19th century imperial culture is plentiful with words and concepts like inferior or subject races, subordinate peoples, dependency, expansion, and authority. Out of the imperial experiences, notions about culture were clarified, reinforced, criticized, or rejected. We will be examining first ideas about colonialism and imperialism more generally, using Said's perspective, to establish what I see as the philosophical context of Greedfall. Afterwards, we will move forward into what I think is the most compelling parallel I could draw upon, or that Said mentions, that almost makes it seem intentional on the part of the developers. Finally, we'll look at the meaning of one of the most significant decisions in the story and world-building of Greedfall, and how I think it makes this game one of the most compelling discourses in colonialism and imperialism across the entire games industry. I hope that by beginning with the specific and now moving to the general before returning to the specific, everyone will understand what I have come to see in this game. There are very few games like it. We'll have ample opportunity to discuss the indigenous groups of Tier 4D shortly, but for now, it's worth noting that as part of the unfolding questline testing faction and companion loyalties, Desarde has the ability to encounter natives to Tier 4D with divergent perspectives. The man in town wants to be a merchant. Ciora is motivated to defend her people. Different leaders of different communities lead military engagements, formulate diplomatic strategies, and craft political alliances with others. One memorable instance of this involves the revelation that one of the clans is working with the Bridge Alliance against the others. The first thing I did when I saw this was check the map. I saw where they were coming from. It made all kinds of sense. The Bridge Alliance are rational empiricists, likely to uphold a treaty out of self-interest for the purpose of trade, which could allow one clan to angle against the others. It feels like a betrayal. It sounds like a betrayal. It looks like a betrayal. But it draws the player's attention to something fundamental about the story of Greedfall, which is that this is not a moralistic fantasy about the good or evil of a colonial or anti-colonial faction. There are traces of those ideas within individual quests, but these emerge competitively throughout the game. Said has some words for perspective and knowledge in an imperialist and colonial context that might be enlightening. Let us begin by accepting the notion that although there is an irreducible subjective core to human experience, this experience is also historical and secular. It is accessible to analysis and interpretation and, centrally important, it is not exhausted by totalizing theories, not marked and limited by doctrinal or national lines, not confined once and for all to analytical constructs. If one believes with Gramsci that an intellectual vocation is socially possible, as well as desirable, then it is an inadmissible contradiction at the same time to build analyses of historical experience around exclusions. Exclusions that stipulate, for instance, that only women can understand feminine experience, only Jews can understand Jewish suffering, only former colonial subjects can understand colonial experience. Said goes on much later to explain the relevance of this stance on intellectual pursuits being incompatible with this kind of more vulgar identity politics and what he thinks the alternative is, saying of academic pursuits laboring under an imperial subjectivity that, thus, the tendency in anthropology, history, and cultural studies in Europe and the United States is to treat the whole of world history as viewable by a kind of Western super-subject, whose historicizing and disciplinary rigor either takes away or, in the post-colonial period, restores history to people and cultures without history. Few full-scale critical studies have focused on the relationship between modern Western imperialism and its culture, the occlusion of that deeply symbiotic relationship being a result of the relationship itself. More particularly, the extraordinary formal and ideological dependence of the great French and English realistic novels on the facts of empire has also never been studied from a general theoretical standpoint. These elisions and denials are all reproduced, I believe, in the strident journalistic debates about decolonization, in which imperialism is repeatedly on record as saying, in effect, "You are what you are because of us. When we left, you reverted to your deplorable state. Know that, or you will know nothing. For certainly there is little to be known about imperialism that might help either you or us in the present." This notion of competing perspectives and how we understand them is central to the reading of Greedfall I am about to develop for you. As Said says, self-definition is one of the activities practiced by all cultures. Who is allowed to develop that self-concept and why, as permitted within the confines of these discursive norms, is limiting to human freedom. Ciora, for example, recognizes this and can be your constant companion to parse the indigenous perspective on the political and social upheavals on Tier 4D during the course of the game. The player's companions have a very different relationship with Desarde when it comes to sharing their perspectives than the faction leaders or more combative faction members, like Inquisitor Aloysius, who the player sees in all his zealous brutality upon entering Theleme's colony. Someone like Aloysius has no uncertainty in his ability to determine who an indigenous person like Siora is. Knowledge in the hands of the oppressor, whether Theleme or Bridge Alliance, faith or science, is a possession for domination. Consider the words of Paulo Freire. As beneficiaries of a situation of oppression, the oppressors cannot perceive that if having is a condition of being, it is a necessary condition for all women and men. This is why their generosity is false. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as inherited property. To the oppressor consciousness, the humanization of the others, of the people, appears not as the pursuit of full humanity, but as subversion. The oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that, in the egoistic pursuit of having as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions, and no longer are, they merely have. Just as the earlier remarks on perspective and the need for self-definition will inform the third section of this essay, these words on the degradation of the oppressor's humanity through their need to possess will inform the fourth and final section of this essay. For now, it will be sufficient to say that oppression constructs and transforms the members of both marginalized and privileged classes. Light and color have a significant place in the themes of Greedfall. The darkness of the Malachor, the disease afflicting the mainland for which Desarde hopes to find a cure on the island, is one such darkness. We see the corruption that begins to ravage Constantine as a similar kind of illness, and the corruption this in turn brings to the mystical creatures of the island can be observed as this dark taint of their more nature-inspired forms, even rising from them like smoke. As the conflict intensifies, it becomes increasingly apparent that prior entanglements and enmity between factions, despite being major hurdles for the player, are secondary to the existential threat of what is happening on the island, to the island, and what lies underneath. Desarde's adventure brings them closer and closer to the heart of the mountain, the heart of the island, and it's revealed that they need to stop Constantine from corrupting the power that lies there. Everything about my attempt to make Greedfall make sense finally fell into place when I considered the literary parallels. For example, in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the speaker Marlowe recounts to the perspective character the story of another journey where he followed in the footsteps of a man named Kurtz into the Congo. Marlowe's adventure is less than heroic, and is in no small part the process of his own disillusionment at the practical realities of imperialist violence, despite the inherent racism of his perspective. At the turn of the narrative, when Kurtz is dying of the disease he acquired on his venture, Marlowe describes his state in the following terms. I tried to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw him to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. This alone, I was convinced, had driven him out to the edge of the forest, to the bush, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of weird incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond the bounds of permitted aspirations. The similarity is striking. I've seen a lot of people asking why they couldn't save Constantine, or bemoaning that they should have been able to. Here's the truth. Constantine is Kurtz, Desarde is Marlowe. I'm confident in this assertion not merely because the developers are clearly intent on referencing literature. Desarde's final words to Constantine are a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet, but also because the thematic parallel is undeniable. Kurtz's final words are, the horror, while Constantine's are, what a shame. The anticlimax of these two character deaths draw together a picture of imperialist power and its insecurity in its self-concept. The final words in Heart of Darkness describe the clouds on the horizon, seen from the River Thames in England, as the titular Heart of Darkness itself, paralleling caricatures of Africa, Kurtz's fatal endeavor, as the Dark Continent. The darkness of Empire therefore threatens to return to the Empire itself. As Said says, Kurtz and Marlowe acknowledge the darkness, the former as he is dying, the latter as he reflects retrospectively on the meaning of Kurtz's final words. They, and of course Conrad, are ahead of their time in understanding that what they call the darkness has an autonomy of its own, and can reinvade and reclaim what imperialism has taken for its own. But Marlowe and Kurtz are also creatures of their time, and cannot take the next step, which would be to recognize that what they saw, disablingly and disparagingly, as a non-European darkness, was in fact a non-European world resisting imperialism, so as one day to regain sovereignty and independence, and not, as Conrad reductively says, to re-establish the darkness. Conrad's tragic limitation is that even though he could see clearly that on one level imperialism was essentially pure dominance and land-grabbing, he could not then conclude that imperialism had to end so that natives could lead lives free from European domination. As a creature of his time, Conrad could not grant the natives their freedom, despite his severe critique of the imperialism that enslaved them. The story of Greedfall reverses this narrative. Now the darkness, the Malachor, this disease corrupting the old world, has driven the mainlanders to the island of Tir-Freddy in search of some salvation. The colonizers are carrying the darkness within them, and what they find is even more unsettling. Here, nestled deep within the heart of Tir-Freddy, is the secret of their whole civilization in several orders. Ptolemy follows a religion whose inspiration seems to have been the experiences their prophet had on this very island. Desarde's real parentage traces back here, as Petrus helps her uncover. Not only did the colonizers bring the darkness with them, on their arrival what they found chiefly was their own origins, their own self-concept. As discussed earlier, it is characteristic of colonial apologetics to characterize what is good in the colonized as arising from the colonizer. Yet here the script is flipped. The colonials construct themselves, their self-concept, through their concept of the native. The sickness is neither the colonizers nor what they colonize. The sickness is colonialism. Said explores this sort of imperialist anxiety in the context of Joseph Conrad's work by calling into question the man's personal experiences and highlighting his historical context, saying, "What makes Conrad different from other colonial writers who were his contemporaries is that, for reasons having partly to do with the colonialism that turned him, a Polish expatriate, into an employee of the imperial system, he was so self-conscious about what he did. Like so many of his other tales, therefore, Heart of Darkness cannot just be a straightforward recital of Marlowe's adventures. It is also a dramatization of Marlowe himself, the former wanderer in colonial regions, telling his story to a group of British listeners at a specific time and in a specific place. That this group of people is drawn largely from the business world is Conrad's way of emphasizing the fact that during the 1890s the business of empire, once an adventurous and often individualistic enterprise, had become the empire of business. The viewer will note that Desarde and Constantin themselves both represent a merchant faction in the colonization of Tir-Freddy. It would be safe to conclude that, as a parallel to Heart of Darkness, Greedfall has this kind of self-conscious approach to imperialism, in accordance to the competing sensibilities of our time and place in history. I feel the game goes further, of course, tending to treat the colonizers, at the very least, as not upholding some inherently idealistic intention, but rather being driven by material circumstance. In either case, it puts the player in the driver's seat of a self-aware colonial narrative, with all the questions of what we are supposed to believe about that narrative that such a position implies. Accordingly, we are invited to question what we think we know. People will sometimes insist that the character of nations in the Global South, a more fitting term for a supposedly unipolar era than Second World and Third World, which were constructs of the Cold War, is fundamentally different and more liberatory than that of nations in the Global North, formerly frequently those nations that constituted the First World and the West. This insistence has a sympathetic character. When a nation-state emerges as a medium for resistance against foreign tyranny by way of creating a structure for international agency, it gains the potential to exist as an equal agent to its people's oppressors, despite perhaps not automatically succeeding in the attempt. The story of such revolutions is one of resistance against oppression, which might lead those with less nuanced views to develop a romantic perspective, one with good guys and bad guys, with noble rebels struggling against evil empires. The grain of truth that the struggle against oppression has a real moral character lends some credibility to this view. But fables have no place in philosophy. Those with a simplistic view of oppression and the oppressed can be nominally left-wing and nominally right-wing, but what they have in common is their chauvinism. In her graphic novel Persepolis, detailing life in Iran's changing socio-political situation in the 20th century, Marjane Satrapi retells a passionate exchange between her family members. It's crazy. The war is happening 4,000 miles away and they're scared. To think that they have so little to worry about that they are getting worked up about nothing. What are you laughing about? We saw some Europeans terrified by the Gulf War on TV, and Dad and I were saying that they must not have enough of their own problems. Since when have you trusted our media? Their objective consists of making anti-Western propaganda. Don't let it get to you, Mom. The Western media also fights against us. That's where our reputation as fundamentalists and terrorists comes from. You're right. Between one's fanaticism and the other's disdain, it's hard to know which side to choose. Personally, I hate Saddam and I have no sympathy for the Kuwaitis, but I hate just as much the cynicism of allies who call themselves liberators while they're there for the oil. Exactly. Just look at Afghanistan. They fought there for 10 years. There were 900,000 dead, and today the country is still in chaos. No one lifted a finger, because Afghanistan is poor. The worst is that the intervention in Kuwait is done in the name of human rights. Which rights? Which humans? The implication here should be obvious. Iranians are not being granted their full humanity because they, as a requisite of furthering specific narratives by Westerners with competing perspectives, are described in two-dimensional terms, either as being in need of liberation by a more enlightened perspective, or as being bloodthirsty cultists of religious state violence. It is easier often for commentators to paint the victims of imperialist aggression as either one thing or another, as opposed to the multitudinous truth that people in many places experience the competition of views, ideas, and perspectives that we also experience. The political struggle within Persepolis is, at least in part, a struggle by Iranians with Iranians against Iranians for Iranians. Mainstream video games rarely have this kind of perspective, instead trending towards, at the very most, engaging in Greedfall's sort of diversified portrayal of indigenous perspectives. Desarde, however, is only indigenous in a limited sense, in the sense of parentage and heritage, being otherwise a person with two perspectives, not exactly representing either fully. This is, of course, the safer path for a developer to take. It is also not oppositional, as noted in the previous section, to understanding these issues intellectually if we merely occupy one perspective or another. The principle of thinking, speaking, and acting against imperialist power, against state violence, against nationalism, is fundamental. This principle is often neglected even by imperialism's ostensible detractors, as Moshe Postone writes in History and Helplessness, discussing the American left-wing reaction to the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Instead of breaking with such dualisms, however, many who opposed American policies have had recourse to precisely such inadequate and anachronistic anti-imperialist conceptual frameworks and political stances. At the heart of this neo-anti-imperialism is a fetishistic understanding of global development, that is, a concretistic understanding of abstract historical processes in political and agentive terms. The abstract and dynamic domination of capital has become fetishized on the global level as that of the United States, or, in some variants, as that of the United States and Israel. It goes without saying that the disastrous imperial and imperious character of the Bush administration has helped mightily in this conflation. Nevertheless, it is unfortunately ironic that in many respects this worldview recapitulates one of a century ago, in which the subject positions of the United States and Israel were occupied by Britain and the Jews. However counterintuitive this similarity between a critique of hegemony today that understands itself as a critique from the left, and what had been a rightist critique of hegemony, it points to overlapping fetishized understandings of the world and suggests that such understandings have very negative consequences for the constitution of adequate anti-hegemonic politics today. Postone highlights the gap between political rhetoric and fundamental political truths. Those truths about imperialism as a social force, being a necessary acknowledgement in the course of fighting against it, cannot be elided by appeals to what we would prefer to think or do. It does not do for those struggling against oppression to adopt the ideological conceits of the oppressor, nor does it aid in intellectual pursuits to flatten distinctions in matters of fact. Postone goes much further, and I recommend the text to all of you, as it has never been more prescient than now. It is not up to Westerners to dictate the terms of resistance against Western colonialism. This is straightforwardly true. However, downstream from the need for this decentering and reorienting of our political worldview is a fundamental acknowledgement of our responsibility. We cannot be consistent in this while being disloyal to our values. We cannot throw up our hands and choose to exist in a state of liminal solidarity, where we believe as we are told without understanding, and sans understanding without committing to a perspective. The need to adjust our perspective in accordance with justice for the oppressed is a moral obligation. The need to, within reason and when necessary, defend that justice is another such obligation. As Said himself says, anyone with even a vague consciousness of this whole is alarmed at how such remorselessly selfish and narrow interests, patriotism, chauvinism, ethnic, religious, and racial hatreds, can in fact lead to mass destructiveness. The world simply cannot afford this many more times. These words ring truer and truer in our time, dark as it is. Fans of Greedfall and Spiders Studios will likely have noticed that in this discussion of themes around colonialism in the game, I've left out one crucial piece of information to which I alluded in the first section. Buried in my examination of the real-world parallels of the different factions was a glaring omission. The identity of the indigenous clans, the Yecht-Fredii. Who are the Yecht-Fredii? Who are the indigenous peoples of Tir-Fredii? Hopefully everything I've been saying will make sense here. I mentioned how Said says the world cannot afford this many more times, and that it is not up to Westerners to dictate the terms of resistance against imperialism. Here's the other shoe I've been waiting to drop. Said writes that, much but by no means all resistance to imperialism was conducted in the broad context of nationalism. Nationalism is a word that still signifies all sorts of undifferentiated things, but it serves me quite adequately to identify the mobilizing force that coalesced into resistance against an alien and occupying empire on the part of peoples possessing a common history, religion, and language. Yet for all its success, indeed because of its success, in ridding many territories of colonial overlords, nationalism has remained a deeply problematic enterprise. When it got people out on the streets to march against the white master, nationalism was often led by lawyers, doctors, and writers who were partly formed and to some degree produced by the colonial power. The national bourgeoisie and their specialized elites, of which Fanon speaks so ominously, in effect tended to replace the colonial force with a new class-based and ultimately exploitative one, which replicated the old colonial structures in new terms. There are states all across the formerly colonized world that have bred pathologies of power, as Eqbal Ahmad has called them. Also, the cultural horizons of a nationalism may be fatally limited by the common history it presumes of colonizer and colonized. Imperialism, after all, was a cooperative venture, and a salient trait of its modern form is that it was, or claimed to be, an educational movement. It set out quite consciously to modernize, develop, instruct, and civilize. Metaphorically, the Yektfridi might be understood to relate in their struggle to colonized peoples generally. However, most directly, they're clearly inspired in their language, their environment, and even in some elements of their culture, by the Celts and the Irish more generally. The ethnic history of Ireland is complex and varied, subject to multiple conquests in addition to British imperialism, but that works from my perspective because my ethnic background is Irish American. Many roots on my family tree trace back to couples and individuals who immigrated from Ireland to America. This is one reason why metaphors around racial and imperial struggle in games like Dragon Age, The Witcher, or Greedfall itself appeal to me so much. What's important about all three of these series is that the way they construct their Irish analogs specifically paints their identity as being lost, often through conquest but also through other means, through historical, cultural, or spiritual development as a group of people whose origins are maybe irreparably distinct from their present, no matter their struggle. My skepticism of nationalism isn't purely a moral objection to its deployment of power, which is unjust, but neither is it strictly a condemnation of forms of nationalism corrupted by circumstance. Said's words ring true to me here because, in accordance with my experience and how we have seen history develop, certain forms of national power and nativist xenophobia have dictated, merely by virtue of how they construct their in-groups and out-groups, certain oppressive conditions to marginalized groups. Even evading these forms of marginalization entails a kind of victimization. While I see the potential for Irish identity, in or outside of Ireland itself, to lend empathy and collaboration to struggles against imperialist and racist aggression everywhere, the common experiences of Irish Americans as I have known them are something else entirely. Never have I known a group of people more prone to insecurity, to racial resentment, to a false sense of being put upon by those groups they consider their inferiors. Again, I speak from personal experience. This is merely anecdotal. While racist and nationalist attitudes in America are diverse and come from many subjectivities, among those people I've known, the jeering, red-faced descendant of Irish diaspora who chooses white pride over Irish pride is one of them. Said gives us two pictures, one in which, quote, nationalism in Ireland, India, and Egypt, for example, was rooted in the long-standing struggle for native rights and independence by nationalist parties like the Sinn Féin, Congress, and WAFT, end quote. And another in which, quote, an unmistakable patriarchal caste can be discerned everywhere in classical nationalism, with delays and distortions in women's and minority rights, to say nothing of democratic freedoms that are still perceptible today, end quote. In search of the context of Yeats's work as an Irish poet, Said deals with the cultural erasure faced by Irish people under British imperialism thusly. More than any of its other colonies, Britain's Ireland was subjected to innumerable metamorphoses through repeated settling projects and, in culmination, its virtual incorporation in 1801 through the Act of Union. Thereafter, an Ordnance Survey of Ireland was ordered in 1824, whose goal was to anglicize the names, redraw the land boundaries to permit valuation of property and further expropriation of land in favor of English and seigneurial families, and permanently subjugate the population. The survey was carried out almost entirely by English personnel, which, as Mary Haymark has cogently argued, had the immediate effect of defining the Irish as incompetent and depressing their national achievement. One of Brian Friel's most powerful plays, Translations, deals with the shattering effect of the Ordnance Survey on the indigenous inhabitants. In such a process, Haymark continues, the colonized is typically supposed to be passive and spoken for, does not control its own representation, but is represented in accordance with the hegemonic impulse by which it is constructed as a stable and unitary entity. And what was done in Ireland was also done in Bengal or by the French in Algeria. And so the process completes itself. If one allows one's identity to become subsumed, then it is a significant challenge to relate to those who have not. The transformation of the Irish in this way signals a fundamental truth, that to be indigenous is not to be original, but to be the alternative party to a geographical region subject to imperialist violence. What I have said here about the corrupting influence of nationalism in the long run, as well as the dangers of assimilation, continues to hold true. Bigotries, like chickens, always come home to roost. Still, there is a chance for Irish anti-imperialist political consciousness that maintains its left-wing advocacy for a more just world. Such a consciousness could never condone the targeting of civilians or any other sort of bystander, with the violence Postone describes analogously to capitalism itself as the ceaseless revolutionizing of the world through waves of destruction that allow for creation for further expansion. This inherently cuts against what is fundamental about a sort of global internationalist politics which calls one to imagine oneself empathetically as relating to other such marginalized groups. How to square this circle? In the words of Paulo Freire in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it is necessary to have faith in the people, by which we mean those oppressed and the larger population, in solidarity with them who struggle genuinely against oppression. As we discussed earlier, he believed that the oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves, end quote. I think this is true even of members of marginalized groups that attain relatively privileged status. How could such a group of people locate their impulse towards freedom and against oppression? Well, earlier in that chapter, Freire says that the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest of human completion. To surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes, so that through transforming action they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. It's beyond the scope of a video game like Greedfall, maybe, to develop the player's understanding of colonialism to the degree that they fully see its specific historical causes. But what is accurately related here is that there are multiple socio-economic forces which marshal colonizers against the colonized, and from this understanding of the characters and factions' motivations, we can draw a certain impression of imperialism's causes. Similarly, we might be able to develop our consciousness as people with irreducible identities. As Said says, no one today is purely one thing. Someone with some sort of marginalized identity of formerly marginalized heritage, who nevertheless also occupies some position of relative privilege as compared with the less fortunate, must deal with the oppressor within as well as the oppressed within. Freire's idea of this process is one that makes oneself accountable to the people, such as when he says, "Conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination." I think Greedfall is beautiful. I think it's more than a game, like The Witcher or Dragon Age, but also an idea. It's a vision of a lost self many of us can no longer inhabit. It's a notion of a past that never existed, that mirrors a real past we struggle to understand. The chances we have to form relationships with works of art like this one should be treasured even as we critically examine them in full. It's not a utopian fantasy. It does, however, use its fantasy landscape to develop our ideas about these historical and philosophical concepts through its creative lens. I value it for that. I feel it's obvious that I cannot disentangle my American perspective from how I understand this fictionalized fantasy exploration of European imperialism and colonization. Like Said, who presents all these arguments now made by Americans before from other empires, we could look to history for parallels to see not the uniqueness of our situation, but rather its shared qualities with others despite differences in circumstance. If historical parallels were not enough to break the conditioning in our minds, then at least one would hope the Americans would consider this. Our tendency to insist we are special as a nation is in fact one of our least remarkable qualities. Among the American patriots, nationalists, jingoists, and imperialists, Lady Liberty insists too much. Nationalism, it seems, cannot undo the knots in which it has tied itself in imperialist pursuits. Our xenophobic insecurity, our hawkish chest-beating, and our exceptionalist patriotism all appear to be different manifestations of the same ideology. Our society is afflicted. This cancer is capitalism.